record the socialization hour area part.
Would you mind putting that information in the chat? That'd be great.
Would love to have people introduce yourselves and what brings you to tonight's event, what your interest in free will is.
Randomly, or are you going to call on us, do popcorn style?
If people raise their hand, then I'll call on them in the order that the hands go up. Otherwise, you can just talk. Kyle.
I'm not really exactly sure on what exactly the topic for this evening, but I've always been a free thinker. In fact, it has gotten me kicked out of a couple of churches as a small child, and I'm happy to be here. So thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming. Yeah, churches tend to be dogmatic. There's a lot of dogma in churches. Not all churches, though. I know some churches that are pretty open-minded, so it kind of depends on which church you go to. But some can be very dogmatic. We are not so dogmatic here. So thanks for coming back, Kyle. Good to see you again. Carrie, go ahead.
Okay, hello. Name's Carrie. And let's see. I just finished Sapolsky's book, Determined, so I'm looking forward to the discussion. And I did read your arguments as well, and this is going to be a fun one. Get ready to
looking forward to
dive into dive into the trenches.
Yeah. I find it interesting. I really try to empathize with the determinists because I was one for so long, for the first 20 or so years of my life. And I haven't found a good...
I've just turned on.
You're not on mute, Daniel. I don't know if you're intending to talk. Okay. People are welcome to speak up, by the way. But yeah, I find that all of the arguments, even by very famous people for determinism, immediately assume that all cause and effect is deterministic. And so if someone has a logical defense of that, please bring it up in the discussion portion, because I haven't heard one. But that said, anyone else want to introduce themselves and what the interest is that you have in free will or on coming tonight? Mary Beth, we record the whole event. I don't know whether or not the folks that edit the videos include the socialization. I don't think they do. So it'll just be on my hard drive or my Google Drive. So it won't go anywhere.
Okay.
But as far as I understand it, I don't think it goes anywhere. But I can't promise that because I don't even do the video editing and I don't go back and watch them very often afterwards. So I don't remember for sure off the top of my head whether or not the socialization is included.
Took you out on YouTube and it wasn't there.
Okay,
but
then it won't be in the future.
Caught me off guard. Sure.
Yeah. Sorry, the recording catches some people off guard all the time. We do it because some people can't make it. Like for people in Europe, this is really late, and we have people in Europe that likes to watch the recordings, and so we record everything. Have for a year and a half, but yeah. Thanks for asking, and thanks for telling me that it's not on there. Now I do know the answer. So you taught me about my own videos. So thank you. Anyone else want to introduce themselves and what interests you in free will?
Well, hello. I'm Luann. I'm in Boston, and I guess I just randomly found this interesting. I tend to wonder if, free will and determinism isn't essentially a religious concept that people are trying to justify with science because they really want, and I tend to think that it's not something that you can actually answer that much. I'm sure that you could map everything if you were really good and really careful, but the fact that you can map whatever makes somebody do something in great detail down to a molecular level does not necessarily mean that that is what caused it. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm coming at this from a non-religious perspective, but I'll be defending free will, which is what religious people typically defend. So I'll be creating a non-religious defense of free will. So that might be novel for some people tonight. So yeah, I'll look forward to your feedback, and thanks for your comments and interest. Slobodan. Hopefully I pronounced that okay. You're on mute, by the way. There you go.
Hi. I was interested, for example, in free will because I was reading Friedrich Nietzsche, and I'm not sure. I have read somewhere that he also talked about free will, but I haven't read exactly what he had to say about free will. So I mean, mainly because of that, I'm interested.
Yeah, he critiqued the traditional concept of free will, but I'm not going to go too much into historical thinkers and what they thought, but yeah, he had a fairly nuanced view, so it's probably a bit to get into. So thanks, Slobodan. And anyone else want to Richard?
Yeah, shouldn't we discuss what will is? What do we mean by will?
That'll be in the beginning of the presentation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because yeah, I use a different definition than the compatibilists. Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think I didn't realize that religion had anything to do with this issue. My interest is sort of philosophical, and I have an intuitive feeling for what the answer to. I would say that free will and determinism are relative, and the question is what relative to what? What determines what are the and what under what circumstances do we have free will, and under what circumstances are things determined? And that's the issue. I regret that I wasn't able to watch the video. Robert Sapolsky, yeah, I know this guy, but I didn't know he wrote something on had something on determinism. He's a great guy.
Yeah, he defends determinism. He's in team determinism, which I'll try to do a good job debunking with accepted science in the beginning of the presentation. Although that's not really the main point. It's kind of an aside, to be honest, because I think the defense of free will is more strong than my debunking of determinism. The defense of free will does debunk determinism as well, but I like to debunk determinism with already accepted science that's not controversial. Because I think it's already been done, and most people don't really acknowledge or realize that, even people who are considered experts on the subject. So, if I'm missing something, I welcome someone pointing it out in the discussion portion, but it feels like everyone's missing something, but maybe it's me that's missing it. So, thanks, Robert. Good to see you, buddy. Anyone else want to? Yeah, Martin.
Yeah, hi, Martin. So my background is biochemistry. I'm a biochemist by training, and I was always interested in philosophy, and in particular also in free will. And I came to a conclusion that most of what we think of free will is essentially an illusion, that pretty much the brain makes decisions, and you could argue it makes decisions freely. It makes decisions based on our background and based on our education and based on what we just ate and based on what we just seen. But essentially, those decisions are made, and then we kind of, in hindsight, observe those decisions. And the most logical way to look at it, the brain kind of makes a story out of it, and the story that the brain makes is, I made a decision. And so this whole idea about free will is pretty much, to some extent, an illusion.
Got it.
Ooh.
I'll be interested to hear if you still feel that way at the end of the evening, and if so, where you stopped following my arguments, because I'll make two pretty good arguments that that's not the case, but you know, we'll get to that in the conversation portion. We won't have as much time for conversation. By the way, I'm probably gonna, after the determinism presentation, I'm gonna ask for feedback about whether or not people want me to go on to defending free will, or whether we should just talk about determinism for tonight, because that's already a lot to bite off. So, you know, we'll see what people want. I'll go by popular opinion. We'll take a majority vote, and the majority will rule.
I just want to introduce myself. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Is there a picture of me?
No, there's no picture. We hear you but don't see you.
Oh, okay. So can you just define what you mean by free will first before we begin? Or because I just got on, I just missed a couple
Yeah, I
minutes.
will do that when I start the presentation. We're just
Okay,
doing a social introduction, so people are introducing themselves, and then
Just want to make sure you can hear me. Okay, good. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Anna, if you meant to be off mute, feel free to unmute yourself, but I think it was an accident. Anyone else want to introduce themselves and what interests you in free will?
I'll just pipe in. Hi, I'm
Hi, Les.
Les from Melbourne, Australia, probably a long way from most of you. I've got an interest in a variety of philosophical areas, mainly in epistemology, philosophy of science, and in ethics. And that's the interesting part of the free will determinism debate, because it hinges quite a fair bit on some issues in moral theory. In particular, I'm what's called a compatibilist. I'm a determinist, at least about human behaviors, but I also think that we can act freely much of the time. And I'm with 60%, that's 60% of professional philosophers who think that free will is compatible with determinism. So thanks.
Yes, I'm going to make a comment about that too, Les, and I'll be interested to hear what you have to say about that. Yeah, I'm not a compatibilist, but Tierra, is that right?
Hello, I'm Tira.
Tierra, welcome.
I have an interest in this discussion very much on both sides of the discussion, because I was raised in a religious belief system where there was determinism that was at the forefront, right? And then as a young adult, in the 10 years I practiced Calvinism. And then I have come to a place where I no longer believe this and am changing my views, but I'm trying to figure out what exactly I do believe and don't believe, right? So having this discussion and actually
Sorry, Leo, I don't think you realized you were not on mute, so I'm going to mute you. Go ahead, Tierra.
Sorry, having this discussion and actually defining what free will is and what it isn't, and talking about the philosophy of these topics on a more intellectual level instead of a spiritual belief level is something that I'm very interested in doing, because I can very much talk about epistemology and things like this, but as far as actually philosophy and things like that, it's a different sort of wheelhouse. So
cool. Thanks. And I don't know, Tamara, if you meant to be off mute, but you were, so I put you back on mute just in case there was an accident. And Phil, go ahead. Thanks, Tierra.
Yeah, Garrett, I'm just going to make a suggestion that with over 50 people on this call, if we all do introductions, we won't have much time.
Oh, we won't have everyone do introductions. We're just going to do them until 7, and then we'll.
I'd like to hear your presentation. Thanks. That's it.
Yeah. We always do socials for the first 15 minutes, and then at 7 o'clock we start the presentation. Sorry, I should have mentioned that, but people have been kind of coming in. So yeah.
All good. Thank you.
No problem. And Tyr, I'm going to try to give a good reason for believing what I think. And if someone proves me wrong, I'll change my mind, and I'm fine with that. And hopefully other people have a similar mindset and we can all learn from each other. Anyone else want to introduce themselves?
I'll
So you
go.
said
If no
there's
one else
50
is speaking, I'll
there's
go.
50 people.
I was first. I was first. Thank you. Thank you very much. With respect, I think I was first. Thank you. Hello, Garrett. My name's Will. I'm in Queensland, Australia, about 3,000 miles north of Les, who's in the hometown where I was born, actually, Les, and, at the Royal Women's Hospital. Thank you very much. Lovely part of the world. Australia, the world's greatest, most livable city, actually, recently voted, Melbourne, Australia. So I digress. I have an interest in free will. I'm reading Determined by Robert Sapolsky. I don't think we can prove it one way or the other. We never will, unless we can create two identical clones, subject them to the same virtual reality experience for X amount of time, and then get each one to choose between the Pepsi or the Coke. And if one chooses differently to the other, we can say, well, how else do you account for that other than free will? But if they never choose differently, no free will. That's the only way we can prove it that I can think of. And I'll just finish by saying it is a very dangerous idea telling people they have no free will. I think it's extremely dangerous to tell people they have no free will. And I think Robert Sapolsky, I'm glad to see Daniel Dennett has vehemently disagreed with him, because it's such a dangerous idea. And I just wanted to ask Les very quickly, of the 40% remaining philosophers that don't believe in free will, don't believe in compatibilism, sorry, what's the breakdown there of determinists and absolutists?
Sorry, why is it dangerous to say there's no free will?
I will cover that in the presentation. So
I think it's dangerous. I think it's dangerous to say there is free will. So
well, we can cover that in the discussion portion. I'll explain why I think it's dangerous to say that we don't have free will. It's not if you're a compatibilist, but it's dangerous to be a hard determinist. But we'll get into that in the conversation portion.
I have no idea.
Would you like me to give the percentage breakdowns of the other non-compatibilist views that Will was asking about?
You're welcome to, Les.
So rounding it up, the libertarian position, which is we have free will and determinism is false, is close to 20% of professional philosophers. The philosophers who think we have no free will is around 10%, and people who accept neither of those three positions, no free will, libertarianism or compatibilism, they comprise around about another 10%.
Thanks, Les. We have time for a couple other, just so people know that have just joined. We do introductions for the first 15 minutes. It's our social portion, and just let people introduce themselves and what interests them in the topic. And then, in 4 minutes, I'll start the presentation. Anyone else want to do introductions?
My name is Nick. I'm interested in the topic because I believe I'm the defender of the underdog, the champion of the little people, and I can't stand the fact that people are promoting there is free will. You're making people feel like living in the cruelty of deep regret, because after all, you're saying we could have done otherwise. You're making people feel like failures if they fail at something. You're making people homicidal and suicidal because after all, you think others and themselves could have done otherwise. And I'm just here defending the no free will because I really can't take this kind of indirect violence anymore. And that's what it is. And I'm here to stick up for the no free will people. Thank you.
Great. Welcome, Nick. I would encourage you to listen with an open mind to all perspectives. And maybe you're right, and maybe you'll convince us. We'll be listening to you with an open mind. But I would encourage everyone to do that. That's what free thinking is about, is to listen to each other with an open perspective.
I don't mean to be rude, but this is a very upsetting topic, what you guys are spreading. So I'm trying not to be rude, but thank you for, you keep an open mind as well then.
I will. And
based on your personal causal history, please keep an open mind.
Yep.
And by the way, we can't choose how rational or intelligent we are. So if I can't convince you, it doesn't mean anything, because you may not be able to, we don't get to choose how intelligent and rational and how well I can present this. It's not up to me. So maybe I'm not presenting it properly or not. It's based on my personal causal history. Thank you.
Maybe.
Nature and nurture.
And maybe, maybe you'll learn something new and maybe not. We'll see. I also would encourage you to consider that if free will is true, it actually empowers us to make our lives better and to help us improve our lives. And actually, it can be a very empowering thing rather than a negative thing.
If determinism is true, you can say the exact same thing. Cause and effect, you should start doing positive things. You can say the exact same thing. And anyway, I agree that maybe no free will is more depressing, but that doesn't mean the truth needs to be suppressed. There's a lot of meaning and hope and beauty in the truth, even if it is worse, even if it is dangerous. We need the truth out, and it doesn't really matter if it's better or worse for society. We want the truth out, and it's better to talk about things as they actually are. So to say it's worse or better is really not relevant. We're just trying to find out the truth.
Well, the only reason I mentioned it, Nick, is because you said that it's dangerous to say that free will exists.
No, I'm saying my personal causal history, that it's much, something just flashed on, that it's much worse to believe in free will. That's my opinion. But even things are flashing, even if it's, even if we can all agree that it's neutral or worse, we just want to get to the truth. So let's not put our personal motivated reasoning behind it.
Yeah, so I agree, Nick. We want to come to the truth, and that's exactly what the first intention of the Freethinker Institute is about. Seeking truth rather than thinking that we're already right. It's through seeking truth that we come to a closer view of the truth. And all of you introduced yourselves, so now I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Garrett Lang. I'm a software developer turned software inventor, now an entrepreneur, and my hobby is writing and discussing practical philosophy. I also happen to be the executive director of the Freethinker Institute, which is the organization that brings you tonight's event. We advertise to a lot of different meetups. We have a lot of partnerships, but the organization that I direct is the one that brings you the events on Tuesday evenings. We are a not-for-profit looking to support and empower members. We focus on trying to help people be the best versions of themselves, seek truth, and be fair, which is our North Star. And we do that through transformational personal and professional development. We have free events like this one every Tuesday evening, covering a wide range of topics not typically covered in academia or industry, at least not widely. And we have weekly members-only events where we apply practical wisdom into our daily lives. I'll probably share a link of FTI links. It's a link of links that will help you learn more about the FTI and membership and other things about the organization. So I also want to say we have only one rule in the FTI, and that is to remain polite. So I will ask everyone to remain polite throughout the evening. That is our only rule. We do take it very seriously, because when we all remain polite, we all remain more open-minded to other people's opinions and ideas. I like to say he or she who loses their temper loses the argument. Even if they actually have the better logical argument, you still lose the argument when you lose your temper. So let's stay calm, cool, collected, and learn from each other, or at least share ideas thoughtfully with an open mind towards learning and seeking truth, as we talked about. And the more we disagree with someone, I would argue, the more important it is to understand where they're coming from and why they came to the conclusion that they did. In the FTI, we call that listening to understand, where we're really trying to empathize with people we disagree with. And we learn the most by doing that. We learn very little by telling someone else why we're right and they're wrong. We don't really learn from that. We learn by understanding how other people came to a different conclusion and why they think that that makes more sense than what we think. That said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. When we hold questions for the end. Will, did you have a comment that you wanted to make?
Just very quickly, Garrett, sorry, I know you want to start and questions are over and introductions, but I do empathize with what Nick said. I see he's very passionate about this, and I'm on board 100%. So much is predetermined. We have so little say in a lot of what we do. So I'm a compatibilist, but reading Sapolsky's book on Determined, it does show you how much little free will we have, and the world in which we're born into, and the circumstances which we're born into, and our various personality traits and our behaviors. We have very, very little say in that. So I totally get what
Yeah,
Nick
let's
is saying.
hold
Yeah,
hold
thank
the
you.
commentary until
Thank
after
you.
the presentation, Will, if you could. So tonight I'm really only going to be debunking determinism and defending some sense of free will. A weak sense of free will is all I'm defending tonight. We'll have another follow-on session where I'll try to make the case that the amount of free will that we have is actually not only quite significant, but very, very large. But tonight, that's not going to be the goal. The goal is to simply show why determinism has been all but completely disproven by accepted science, and why even if you believe in superdeterminism, which is the one ground left to believe in determinism, then I think that that's actually not defensible either once you understand my argument defending free will. So that said, I am going to start with my background regarding free will, just very briefly, and then the case against determinism, and then we'll take a vote on whether or not we continue on to free will tonight or whether we do that at a future event. It'll be audience, we'll do like a poll. Audience will determine whether we go through to free will. The case for determinism already leaves a lot to go through. The presentation will probably be over an hour, just to be honest, if I do both. So I'll give that caveat up front. When I did free will alone, it was almost an hour, if not around an hour. We also took questions along the way at the time, so it may actually go much quicker. I'm not sure. So we'll go through determinism. We'll see how quickly we go. So first, my background, I was an atheist determinist for about the first 20 years of my life, until in a 400 level computer science course, I was introduced by a Turing Award winner, who was my professor, to Gödel's incompleteness theorem. I immediately realized that this was something that would disprove determinism, and my confirmation bias basically made me resist that and try to prove Gödel wrong. Well, at the end of the day, when I tried to prove Gödel wrong, Gödel won, and I changed my mind, and I learned what I would now say is a new, better truth. I wrote my essay on free will in 2007 for anyone that looked at it and saw the date. It's had a major revision. I originally based it on the many worlds hypothesis, which I realized was overly complex, not necessary, and not as well defended as the rest of the essay, and that I could take a different spin on it that was more defensible. So I did that. I think it's pretty solid ground. It's the essay that I've written that I've circulated the most and gotten the most amount of feedback on, including by a PhD who specializes in free will, another PhD in philosophy that is pretty well versed on free will arguments, neither of whom found good reasons to think that I was wrong. So we're gonna save questions and comments until the end if we could. So if everybody could go on mute, like we're not a webinar, but if you could all go on mute. Let me actually just mute people just so that people don't accidentally speak. Just because we have now 70 people last I checked. Yeah, we're about 70. So I don't have an agenda here. I was a determinist atheist, and then I logically proved myself wrong, and then I started believing in free will. But some of what Nick said really resonated with me as well. Like, if determinism is right, I can't feel bad about all the stupid stuff I've done in my life and all the mistakes that I've made. It was just, that was the only possibility. And so it sort of absolves you of personal responsibility in some respects, because whatever you do, that was the only thing you could have done. But for now, like a number of people have said, my goal is to seek truth, which is the first intention of the Freethinker Institute. And that's what I'm here to do, is to seek truth together. And I'll share my opinions, but I'll look to learn from the audience as well. I always learn from these events, even if I'm presenting, and that's part of the fun of it. So there are a lot of puzzle pieces to the argument defending free will. And if you believe in free will, there are a lot of things that today seem mysterious that no one can really explain or understand, because most scientists are, the majority of scientists are determinists. Or how should I say this? I have to phrase it carefully. There is a much larger percentage of determinists amongst scientists than there is amongst the general population. So that's the right way to phrase it. So so it turns out that a lot of things that science can't make sense of, if they simply believed in free will, they would be able to make a lot of sense of them. And I'll allude to a few of those things, but not go into them in detail. We've had other events on some of them, like consciousness, which becomes very understandable if you believe in free will, and a couple of other things. So that said, definition of determinism, this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Causal determinism is basically the idea that every event is necessitated by antecedent events, along with the laws of nature, which are generally thought of as the laws of physics or the physical laws of the universe. And that is not our understanding of the laws of physics. That is totally irrelevant. What we understand about it and don't has nothing to do with determinism. Determinism is the laws of physics themselves, like the capital T, the laws of physics, are the only thing essentially creating the future events that we observe and experience, and that only one possible future can happen. So there are no choices in that. There's only one thing that you can do at any given time. You may feel like you have a choice, but if determinism is right, you don't really have the choice. You have what someone in the social described as the illusion of choice. So determinists like to say, well, maybe when something happens, you know, and people alluded to this in the social, is that we don't really understand what causes the future, but it's these secret, what are called in science, hidden variables, by people that study it, that determine what's going to happen in the future. We don't really know what all the variables are, but someday we will know. Someday we're going to learn enough about science. We're going to have enough measurement systems. We're going to have enough computing power. We'll be able to consider all of the different effects. And once we know all of those different effects, we'll be able to determine the future with precision. But what I'm going to show you is that something called Bell's theorem basically shows that local hidden variables, and by the way, by local, what that means is that it's a hidden variable within the distance by which two, well, I think this is the next slide. It's within the distance by which two, you know, local sounds really close, right? But it's actually the distance by which two particles were entangled. And the Chinese actually were the ones to entangle particles at the furthest distance. They took particles from Earth's surface and they entangled them with particles in space. And so like the upper atmosphere, which is essentially the beginnings of space. So that's a pretty big distance. So what I'm going to explain is that what that basically means is that the quantum fluctuations that quantum mechanics scientists see has to be explained deterministically by mass energy that is further away than space from Earth's surface, and not deterministically influenced by things closer than that. That's what Bell's inequality tells you. This is accepted science. It's not controversial. No one says Bell's inequality is wrong. They just don't really understand exactly how to apply it to determinism. And that for some reason is not widely circulated. And I don't know why. If anyone knows the answer to that, I would love to hear it in the Q&A portion. So the other thing to note at the same time is that every single one, like 100% of the laws of physics that we know about, all of them, like without fail, things that are closer have a bigger effect on things than things that are further away. The inverse square fields law is an example of this. All the exceptions to the inverse square fields law still have the quality where closer things have a bigger impact than further things. The weak and strong nuclear forces, all of these things, they all closer is a bigger impact. So if we're going to believe what is the last bastion of for those that are, really well versed on the Bell's inequality, the last bastion of determinism, the last stronghold is called superdeterminism, which is basically saying that it's mass energy further than outer space that is deterministically producing the apparent fluctuations, which are right now described as randomness. I'm going to argue they're more likely a combination of randomness and free will. But if we get to the discussion on free will, I'll make that argument. And so they're basically saying that it's that mass energy further away than outer space that causes that quantum fluctuation that is observed by quantum mechanics. So that's what superdeterminism is. It seems really hard to believe that every single one of the laws of physics that we're aware of is going to find an exception in something when there is, in my opinion, a much better explanation. And that's why if someone wants to believe in superdeterminism after my presentation on determinism, on why I think determinism has been all but disproven by accepted laws of physics, I'm not going to argue with you like that. Like, you're welcome to have that opinion. You're welcome to share why you have that opinion in the discussion portion, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because for me, it's much more interesting to talk about why I can defend free will with a much higher degree of certainty, because I think that's the final nail in the coffin of determinism, if I'm right about that argument for defending free will. I will say right now I want the determinists to check emotions at the door. This is going to be a little bit of an emotional argument. I don't normally do emotional arguments. I just happened into this, and again, I was a determinist, so please understand that I'm saying this about my former self in saying it. I come to this conclusion because I think it's logically true, and I find it fascinating when you look at determinism with this lens, which I think is a logically applied lens to determinism. And I'm going to walk you through it. But first, let's look at some definitions. Sorry, I think I got the copy and pasting wrong. So omniscient first is having unlimited knowledge, awareness, or understanding, or perceiving all things. Well, the laws of physics themselves, again, not our understanding of them, but the laws of physics themselves have to have a complete knowledge of the entire universe because they are acting on all of the mass energy in the universe. Now, sure, they're not like sentient, so they don't know it, but they have unlimited knowledge or sort of interaction, which is, a perception of sorts. And so, even if not from a sentient being's perspective, they really act upon all the mass energy in the known universe. If my argument on the origins of the universe is accurate, it's actually on all the mass energy in the universe, the infinite universe, infinite in both terms of time, space, and mass energy. But let's just, believe whatever you want about the size of the universe. Everything in the universe, the laws of physics are acting on, if determinism is right, to bring about the next moment in time. And therefore, they have, as much awareness as anything of all the other things in the universe. So I would say that the laws of physics and determinism basically meet the definition of omniscient. Now, the next is the definition of omnipotent. It's either almighty or infinite in power, or having great or unlimited authority or power. Great power, although it's not, the laws of physics, there are people who would call the laws of physics godlike, and there are the panpsychists that will say that the universe itself is sort of sentient in a way, and but let's not go there, although I find it intellectually interesting to talk about. That's not the topic for tonight. But if we were to talk about determinism being right, it is literally the only power in the entire universe acting on everything. And so it has exclusivity on power, which is definitely very great power, right? Like, if you're the only power, you're the only show in town, and you're the greatest power because you're the only power that exists in the entire universe. So that's clearly great power. So I would argue determinism is right, then the laws of physics meet the definition of omnipotent. So now what do we realize is that determinism basically requires more faith in the laws of physics because it's omniscient and omnipotent than medieval man or even modern man has in God, who says that God is omniscient, omnipotent, and benevolent. Only you're believing in a sort of cold, harsh reality, laws of physics, which aren't even benevolent, but are omniscient and omnipotent. By the way, I don't believe in omnipotent, omniscient God. I'm not a believer in the Abrahamic religions. I think Epicurus did a pretty good job describing why omnipotent, benevolent God doesn't exist. But that's another topic for another night. But interestingly, the determinist essentially believes in omnipotent, omniscient laws of physics. And so it's basically more faith in the laws of physics than man has in God. So than the Abrahamic religions have in God. So again, I know that can be, frustrating to hear for some people. I don't mean to frustrate anyone. I just found that when I thought about like the implications of determinism, I realized, wow, like the reason I always was a determinist is because I didn't want to have faith and I didn't feel comfortable having faith. I wanted to follow reason wherever it followed. And now I have a logical reason to believe in free will. And then when I look backwards, I realize I actually was having faith in the laws of physics, having the answer to all questions eventually. And so, that for what it's worth is, basically my argument that determinism has been, more or less all but completely disproven by accepted science. And I'm going so far as to call it a fringe concept without logical defense, but we can discuss that. Like, I'm open to being wrong. Again, I realize that the majority of people here probably are determinists, and I'm okay with that. I'm the redheaded stepchild of redheaded stepchildren in some of these presentations, including the one on the origins of the universe. So with that said, we all feel like we have free will intuitively. So even the hard determinists that I've met will agree that they feel like they have free will. They just feel like it's an illusion. And I have a little sort of semi joke, which is when someone tells me something is an illusion, I think they're under an illusion that it's an illusion. And so I like to understand why someone thinks that something is an illusion rather than reality. Because if you don't have a better reason for thinking that something is an illusion, then it's more likely than what we perceive as reality is reality. So, George, we're just going to hold questions until the end of determinism, and then I'll ask people whether or not we want to go on to free will. We could also have, yeah, we'll ask people if we want to do Q&A after determinism or if we want to go on to free will. So I do think, though, that the other reason that I had so much faith that science would eventually have the answer to so many questions is that, or to all questions was what I used to believe, is that it's come, well, I think that's actually on the next slide. So I'll show in the defense of free will why I think that science will not eventually have the answer to all questions. And I am very open to going against intuition when there's strong logic defending it. Some people said, I think it was Nick saying, like, shouldn't we seek truth rather than what's most pragmatic or what's, the easiest or the most comforting? I agree with that. I'd much rather the cold, harsh reality than to be told sweet lies or to believe sweet lies. I think we should seek truth, but we should also acknowledge that there are different perspectives and we should listen to all perspectives with an open mind, which is the second intention of the Freethinker Institute, which is to transparently share our beliefs with other people and then to listen with an open mind to other people when they share reasons that our beliefs might be wrong. And we all as human beings have confirmation bias, which is the desire to look for reasons that our current beliefs are right. We had a whole event on confirmation bias at the FTI, a whole event dedicated to it because I think it's that important. So many people are stuck in confirmation bias. Don't let yourselves be one of those. Just always keep an open mind to new ideas that will help you find new truths. I like to say, if you learn a new truth and you accept that it's right, you're not wrong. You're immediately right again. You're just more right than you were before, as long as you admitted you were wrong with good judgment. And so admitting you're wrong makes you more right than staying of the same opinion when it actually becomes clear that your old opinion is no longer accurate. That said, I'm going to try to show that logic and intuition, truth, logic, and intuition actually all align. I think there was a poll that went up. I don't know what that's from. So someone's playing around with settings. So next is on compatibilism. So I did say I was going to talk about this. This started from Hume, this idea that determinism is right, but we still have free will. Let's walk through that logically. And guys, feel free to point out if I'm missing something here, but this is how I walk through that argument logically. If determinism is right, there is only one possible choice that we can make at any given time. There's only one possible result of any possible thing that we think is a choice. Only one possible thing could happen. And therefore, there's no freedom in free will at all, because only one thing can happen. In order to have freedom, to me, like the very definition of freedom needs to allow some optionality or some concept of choice to exist. The illusion of freedom is just the illusion of freedom. It's not actual freedom. So I like to joke there's no freedom in free will if determinism is right. And so while I think that it's a very convenient choice to be a compatibilist because you get to side with science, quote unquote. By the way, I don't think it's about siding with science. I think that science is very compatible with spirituality and even religion if they're thought about in the right way, which it's generally not by religions. But we had another event on that topic for people that want to look at it. Go back on YouTube about the compatibility with science and religion. And actually, we may have lost that video. And if we did, then I'll do it again because I think it's fascinating. I want to end the war between science and religion and spirituality by having them both be able to have their own spaces, because I think they do both have their own spaces logically. And so all I would say is that compatibilism is a convenient choice because it allows you to get the benefits of believing in free will where you can control your own destiny, but it also allows you to kind of side with science and say, well, science did so much for us since the Enlightenment. Like, let's face it, like the world has been revolutionized since the Enlightenment, everything from electricity and cars and the internet and now generative AI models. Like there's just so much amazing stuff that if someone 500 years ago saw an iPhone, they would think you were a magician and that you could perform magic. Even 100 years ago, they would think that, to be honest. So that said, if compatibilism is correct, this is the implications, the negative, the dark side of the implications of if determinism is right. Well, then theoretically, it takes away, in some respects, it takes away the logical justification for moral punishment. Because if you look at a serial killer, they can't help but kill people. That's just the way they were born. It's not their choice that they killed those people if determinism is right. So how can we hold them morally responsible? It would be immoral for us to hold them morally responsible. And so theoretically, we shouldn't put anyone in jail or punish anyone for anything because no one actually chose to do any of the bad things that they do. Nor should we reward anyone for doing anything good because they didn't choose to do those good things. That was just the only thing they could do. Now you can post de facto justify any kind of punishment and any kind of reward by saying, well, the only thing I could do was to punish the serial murderers. Like I had no choice. But the problem with determinism is you can justify anything by saying that was the only possibility. And so there's no really there's no freedom in that, right? It's all kind of like it's a feeling of helplessness. Like you can't have you have no influence on your future. And so while I didn't feel like that when I was a determinist, I was actually a compatibilist. And so I acted like I had free will, even when I thought logically that I didn't. that was very convenient for me because I still was a nice person and did the right things, and I studied really hard and all that stuff. But you know, that's kind of why the moral implications of determinism are, you know, it's not all bad, right? And this is where, you know, to Nick's point, like you can look, if you're a determinist, you can look at free will as a horrible thing. And I see where he's coming from with that. You can also look at, you know, determinism as a horrible thing if you believe in free will. And, you know, I'm a glass half full kind of guy, so I'm going to try to look at the positive side of either one, whichever one we come to the logical conclusion of. You know, Marcus Aurelius was really, you know, if I'm not wrong, was really a determinist. He believed everything was part of logos and there was only like one possible future, except the way that you were born and the future that you were born into. And yet he was a really good guy, right? And he was one of the wisest men alive at his time. And I'm a big practicing Stoic, so I love Marcus Aurelius, but like he was that good potentially because he thought he had to be, which I think is fascinating too. So that said, that's the end of the case against determinism. It's 7:30, so it was only half an hour. But I will say my guess is that it's going to take at least that long to go through free will. So whoever did the poll, are you able to do a poll on whether or not we should go to, maybe I can do a poll on whether or not we should go to determinism or go to free will, or whether we should go to Q&A. Where's polls? Let me stop the share so that I can try to get, here we go, polls quizzes. So new poll.
It sure was a good Christmas dinner, honey.
All right, so I'm not going to do required, but launching the poll now. So please vote on whether or not you want to go to Q&A or go to the free will presentation. All right, I see a lot of decisiveness in going to free will. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I will end the poll in 1 minute. We have 51 voting and 38, 39 in favor of go to free will. So it's 74 to 26% right now. So I think that's with 54 voting, I believe that's a final result. So share results so that way you guys can see it. So I'm going to go ahead and go on to free will. So the case for free will, it is a little bit long. I'm going to have a quick drink. But I think it's pretty interesting. I did my best to, in the presentation, clarify a part of the essay that a lot of people have had trouble with, and I'm hoping that I'm going to manage to do that. And you guys can tell me in the Q&A whether or not I did it. I'll point it out when we get there. It does use some complex concepts, so I tried to simplify it as much as possible. It's definitely simpler than when it was including the multiverse. But just write down questions and I'll answer them all at the end of the presentation. I am happy to take questions on the determinism part, although I think the free will part is more interesting, but you know, like everyone can choose what they want to ask about. So start with definitions. I define free will in a more specific way than the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. First, I define it as non-determinism, as I described. I don't consider compatibilism to have any freedom in the free will. I advocate for a type of free will that does have freedom, where multiple potential outcomes are possible when a person makes a decision. And so there are non-deterministic decisions made by human beings. I'm not going to talk about how strong of an influence they can have on the future. That's a matter of how much free will we have. We'll talk about that another night. But the second qualification for free will is that a being's conscious effort to make one of those outcomes more likely has a statistically significant impact on the likely outcome of which possibility the being experiences. In other words, the more you try to do something, the more likely it is to happen. Now, I will talk about, I think that I'm going to get to how the point at which the decision itself is made is not actually in the conscious mind. And I don't think neuroscientists have proven that. Libet actually backed that out. I copy and pasted that.
Garrett, can you say the first again, please? Sorry.
The first one is non-determinism, so meaning that more than one possible future is possible. So like if I'm going to choose what I'm going to eat for breakfast, I can choose cornflakes and Cheerios, and both of those are possibilities. I get to non-deterministically decide. And yes, like if I hate Cheerios, there's a very low likelihood that I'm going to eat Cheerios. But if I like Cheerios and cornflakes equally, then when I wake up in the morning and I decide on Cheerios and cornflakes, there is a possibility that I could choose either one. And it's not the laws of physics themselves deciding, it's, you know, the being's conscious effort, which is number two, that makes one of them more likely to happen than the other. Now, theoretically, I could choose cornflakes and some guy could come up to me and put a gun to my head and say, you eat those cornflakes, buddy, and I'm pulling the trigger. And probably I won't eat the cornflakes then. It's not worth it to me to eat cornflakes for a gunshot to the head. So, all I'm saying is that a conscious decision can make one outcome more likely. So that's what I define. And you'll see at the end of the presentation, I'm going to go back to this definition and ask you, have I proven this? And then we'll go into the conversation and we'll talk about whether or not I've proven that both of these criteria are true. So the first part, and I think the harder part, is that non-determinism is true. And even though I think that it's largely been disproven by accepted science, I didn't know that when I wrote the essay on free will. And so I went about trying to disprove determinism, and I wrote a computer science type proof to try to prove it. And so that's what I'm going to be presenting to you today. So the only assumptions that I make are, one, that the principle of invariance holds true. And what that means is that the laws of physics themselves, not our understanding of the laws of physics, which change over time, but the laws of physics themselves are constant throughout time. Again, not our understanding of them. That obviously changes over time, but the laws of physics themselves don't change, meaning you're not going to drop a brick one day and it's going to suddenly drop upward, right? On Earth's surface, under normal conditions, no crazy exceptions made, but under normal conditions, it's not just going to simply drop upwards. The next is that formal logic holds true, because I use formal logic. I don't use a lot of formal logic. I use shoot, I'm blanking on the name, but I use like the logic of language, but it is formal logic, but in language form.
They want to see your screen share if you have it. Do you have the screen
Oh,
share?
I'm sorry. Thank you, Katie. That's a good reason to talk over me. I appreciate that. I don't mind when people talk over me, by the way. I'll usually just be quiet. I used to get really annoyed by that. I find a lot of people do get annoyed by it, but I don't mind. Can you guys see my screen now? Good, good. Thank you, Katie. I appreciate that. And I saw your RSVP. No, I'm really glad you made it. Theorems, I would have gone through the whole presentation without presenting if you hadn't. No, I'm just teasing. Someone would have called me out. So the next is that the theorem that I'm relying on, the theorems that I'm relying on are true. I'm not reproving Bell's incompleteness theorem or Bell's inequality or Gödel's incompleteness theorem. By the way, there were two different Gödel's incompleteness theorems. I'm using one of them. I don't know of a good way to refer to them other than I will describe what the assumptions are in the one that I'm using and what the implications are. And then for anyone that's familiar with both, you'll know which one I'm using. So, next, Gödel's incompleteness theorem. I have to introduce this. It's, like I said, it was the impetus for me writing the essay in the first place. What I'm going to do is say, the way that Gödel's incompleteness theorem works is it assumes that you have a universal truth machine. And what this is it's a essentially a proof by contradiction where you assume something is true, and then when you come to a contradiction in your logical system, that basically tells you that the thing that you assume to be true is actually false. And so basically, if we have a universal truth machine, which is a black box, if you will, that you can ask any question to, you just ask it a question, it will always give you the correct answer. So this universal truth machine is always right. It's never wrong by its definition. Now, ask the universal truth machine whether or not the following statement is true or false. The statement is, the universal truth machine will never say this statement is true. So let's assume that the universal truth machine says the statement is true. Well, then clearly the statement is false, even though it said it was true, because the statement says that the UTM will never say the statement is true. But it did say it was true. So clearly that's not an option. All right, let's go to option number B. Let's say the universal truth machine says the statement is false. Well, it's wrong again, because now the universal truth machine said the statement was false, and it said it will never say the statement is true. And so the statement is actually true, but the universal truth machine said it was false, even though the statement is true. So what can we learn from this? What we learn from this is there is no universal truth machine. And the exception, when I first read about it, I said, oh, this is kind of like a fringe, like not very important, esoteric type of statement that's like contrived just to trip up the universal truth machine. Well, I thought a lot about it, and I actually came up with a name for this, and I call them self-defining statements, self-defining questions. They're questions where the answer is defined in the question itself, and where there's a self-referential statement. And I don't know if I'm gonna make the argument today, but I will argue that free will is such a thing, because the essence of our free will, I will argue another day, is the spirit, what religions call a soul. And I will argue the spirit or soul is self-defining, and therefore it is one of those self-defining statements or questions. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. So let me first talk about a consistent UTM could answer all other types of questions accurately, which is pretty darn cool. Like basically anything other than self-defining statements, a UTM that's consistent could answer all of the other types of statements accurately. And I will talk about why that's important a little later. But there are, by the way, just to give credit where it's due, Miskatonic is this random little website that I thought did the best. It's been around since I was in college over 20 years ago. And that's where I found Rudy Rucker's explanation of the universal truth machine. I simplified Rudy's explanation of the universal truth machine down a little bit to make it easier to digest. Although his was the easiest to digest. If you try to look up the other explanations for Gödel's incompleteness theorem, they're pretty difficult to understand. And that might have been pretty difficult to understand. I've just done this a lot, so maybe it's feeling easier than it should. And so I don't fault anyone if it seemed difficult. But I will, if you Google Miskatonic, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and read Rudy Rutgers, you can kind of study that on your own and try to prove him wrong. And if you manage, tell me how, because I wasn't able to. I got convinced by Gödel. So note that the SCP, now the next thing I want to talk about is where does Gödel's incompleteness theorem apply? And basically the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes that it applies to all formal systems that contain Robinson arithmetic and are consistent. Essentially, Robinson arithmetic basically means addition. For those not familiar with this mathematical concept, it's kind of an esoteric one, to be honest. It's not commonly discussed. It's a little similar to piano arithmetic, but it's a little more simplified. All it has is addition and multiplication of natural numbers, meaning, from zero, integers counting up, from zero and integers counting up from one and higher up infinitely. And so if you can imagine a logical system that is able to do addition and multiplication of 0 and positive numbers, that is a system that contains Robinson arithmetic, and Gödel's incompleteness theorem therefore applies to that logical system. And I'm going to use something called I forget I call it problem transformation, but there's a technical name for it that I'll get to in the slide. So let's suppose that I'm right about my belief that the physical universe is infinite with mass energy in it. If you didn't come to the talk on the origins of the universe, I highly recommend it if the topic interests you, you like cosmology. It isn't on YouTube yet, but it should be in the next month or two. Now, showing that Robinson arithmetic is contained in the physical universe does actually require belief in that. So that might be, for some of you, the hardest part of tonight's lecture to buy. If you don't believe that the universe is infinite with infinite mass energy, don't worry, you're not alone. Most of the world doesn't believe that either. But I think that I have a very good logical reason for believing that. For now, just bear with me, assume that that's true for tonight, and watch the lecture on the origins of the universe. And if you can find a fault with that lecture, come back to me in the online community, which I put the presentation, I put in the, by the way, I don't see anything on the chat. There's no way I can present and follow the chat. And so if any of the moderators need my attention, just speak over me, because I won't be able to follow. So let me just put the chat in again, and it also has our YouTube. Here we go. It also has our YouTube channel where you can find the Origin of the Universe lecture. So let's imagine that the universe is infinitely large in time, space, and mass energy. Now, let's just assume that we want to do addition. You can imagine X atoms in a row, where X could be up to infinity, and Y atoms in a row, and you put them next to each other on a line, and you add X plus Y. Well, that's addition, and you can add all the way up to infinity because you have an infinite amount of mass energy and you have an infinite amount of space. Now let's show multiplication. You have the same scenario, except it's a square of atoms, X wide, X atoms wide, and Y atoms tall. Now you have X times Y, and you have multiplication. Boom, there's Robinson arithmetic immediately in this infinite universe of mass energy. So now we've shown that the physical universe itself can represent addition and multiplication of the natural numbers. So that's what's required for Robinson arithmetic to apply, or containing Robinson arithmetic is what's required to have Gödel's incompleteness theorem apply to it. And so that will bring us to the next question, which is problem reduction. And this is something that we use in computer science to show that when there are two different problems that are different types of problems, we use problem reduction to show that those two problems are logically equivalent. And that's what I'm going to do next. This is the part that has been the hardest, as well as showing that the physical universe contains Robinson arithmetic have been the parts I just never did it before. So now I think it was pretty straightforward to show that it contains Robinson arithmetic, but it does require the assumption of, it's not an assumption, I think I can logically defend it, but it requires the belief that the universe is infinite with mass energy and space. So let's say you have two problems. You have problem A and you have problem B. If you can solve problem A, then if you've done a problem reduction and you've shown that problem A and problem B are logically equivalent, by solving problem A, you have also solved problem B. And so that's basically showing that they are logically the same problem. So if you go to Wikipedia, there's a thing called reduction of complexity, and that talks about problem reduction. So I'm basically going to use it to show that the laws of physics are essentially a logical system, which Gödel's incompleteness theorem applies to because it contains Robinson arithmetic. So that's a mouthful, but hopefully you're following me. So let's talk about the laws of physics as a logical system. So we've shown that Gödel's incompleteness theorem applies to the physical universe if it's infinite with infinite mass energy. And so now I'm going to show that the laws of physics are logically equivalent to the UTM that we talked about in Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So let's look at the smallest finite space at a point in the coordinate system of X, Y, and Z. Call it a single point in space. It might be like a sphere of Planck length, which is the smallest measurable space, but it might be much smaller than that. I would argue it's probably much smaller than that. I think Planck length is more about measurement and not about actual size. But let's just say that eventually we get to, some smallest, point at which anything else is rounding error. And that at that point in time space, that mass energy at time t either exists or does not exist. And by the way, for those not familiar, mass energy is the term to, a photon is 100% energy, no mass. And then, something at, mass at 0 degrees Kelvin is 100%. In theory, it hasn't been detected ever, and unsure whether or not it could ever happen. But theoretically, mass at 0 degrees Kelvin is totally stationary mass, no vibration whatsoever, and it's all mass, no energy. Now, mass energy is just the term used. Mass and energy are convertible. That is a part of mechanics, physics, which I took honors mechanics in college, so this is where I learned about mass energy. But basically, if you take a point, an infinitesimally small point at time t, then mass energy either does or does not exist at that point. Now take the infinite universe and take all the points in the infinite universe, and there's an infinite number of them. There are an infinite points in which mass energy does and does not exist, and you can actually enumerate them in integers. And then the laws of physics themselves basically can be the universal truth machine. And what you ask the laws of physics is, at time t plus delta t, which is a Planck length of time, which is believed to be the smallest length of time that could exist. And then let's assume that, if there's a smaller one, we use that. But t plus delta t is in physics meant to be a really, really small increment of time. So at time t, we ask the laws of physics themselves, which are our universal truth machine, is mass energy going to be at this point in the next moment in time? And essentially what we're doing is we're creating a problem transformation where if the laws of physics can answer that question for all points in space, then it is a universal truth machine because it knows all aspects of the truth at the next moment in time. Well, we already know from Gödel's incompleteness theorem that it's impossible to have a universal truth machine. So we know that, it's impossible for the laws of physics themselves to know where mass energy is going to be at the next moment in time. And I'm going to talk about that in now I remember I have a couple of slides that are going to be kind of lead-ins into future events about the implications of free will, if I'm right about it. So, after that one Planck length in time, I just described this. And so essentially, this is basically the exception to the laws of physics has to be those self-defined influences on the physical universe. Now, that could be non-deterministic randomness. And so let's ask ourselves, what could self-defined influences on the physical universe look like? It could be, well, first let me say it another way, because this is a little hard to get your head around. If the laws of physics are perfect, as determinism implies, then we could determine exactly whether or not mass energy is in each one of those infinite points in space. In which case, the laws of physics have essentially determined everything that happens in the universe at the next moment of time, which is what determinism says. However, doing that says that the laws of physics are a UTM, which basically means that it's answering every question put forth to it, which is whether or not there's mass energy at every infinitesimally small point in space at the next moment in time. And if it could answer that, it literally could answer anything, and determinism is right. But what Gödel's incompleteness theorem shows is that we've already shown that Gödel's incompleteness theorem applies to the physical universe. Therefore, the laws of physics can't answer every single question about the physical universe. And that's the clever part of the way that I applied Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Someone tried to do it after I wrote my essay. Someone tried to apply Gödel's incompleteness theorem to free will, but I don't think they did it the right way. That said, because we know that Gödel's incompleteness theorem applies to the physical universe, we know that it's impossible that the laws of physics could determine the mass energy at every point in time in the at the next moment in time in t plus delta t, which is after an infinitesimally small amount of time passes. So, self-defined possibilities. There are two that I can think of. If anyone can think of a third one, bring it up in the conversation. I've only been able to think of two. One is randomness, which is for me like very likely to exist. It would be hard for me to deny that randomness exists. I think that randomness at the quantum level all evens itself out, and so it doesn't have an impact on the macros function. But then the next is that we could have an essence of ourselves. I alluded to earlier. I call it a spirit. Religions call it a soul. Because I'm not religious, I use the word spirit because it's not as loaded with all the stuff that religion wants to load it with that I don't think I can logically defend. I think that I can defend that such an essence of ourself exists, but I can't do a whole lot more than that. I can do a little more than that, and we'll do that in other sessions. So we've shown that free will and or randomness exists in the universe. So one, the other, or both. Now, and we've also shown that the universe is non-deterministic. Now, since today we're talking about free will, I'm only going to address the free will portion, even though I said I kind of believe in randomness and I think that it evens itself out. I'm not going to digress on that. I'm going to talk about free will. So there are two possibilities with free will. We all would admit that we have the feeling that we have free will. No one, even the hard determinists I know, don't deny that we feel like we have free will. The question is whether or not it's an illusion. So there are two possibilities here. One, our feeling that we have free will is an illusion of free will that evolved randomly, because the only other place that something like that could evolve is randomly. And it gave us the perception that we have free will, but our free will is not actually free. It's guided by randomness. Or two, we actually do have free will. Now, there are two aspects of that. Well, I'm not going to digress on that. It gets a little complicated. So I'll say there's a little bit of a better defense for number two, that we actually have free will, than I'm going to go into, but we can get into it in the Q&A. So number one would mean that randomness has somehow, and I would welcome people's explanations of how or why it would evolve to disguise itself as free will, even though we don't really have free will. If number one is correct, we don't have free will. It's just an illusion of free will. Why would such an illusion of free will be advantageous? And I'll look at that a little more closely. If you look at, and first is, can we identify randomness? If you look at a series of numbers generated by a random number generator on a computer, which by the way are not really random, generally speaking, they're algorithmic, but they're designed to look like they're random. So you can recognize that those numbers are pseudo-random. They seem random, and you don't know what's going to come next. And so we don't have the feeling that those numbers have a pattern to them. If you look at a random number generator, it's going to look totally random. It'll always look totally random. Even if you stare at it all day, it's going to seem totally random. Now, while maybe occasionally when we make decisions, we feel like they're made a little bit randomly or a little arbitrarily. Like my Cheerios and cornflakes example, I may feel like that's a little random because I like both, 6 of one, half a dozen of another. I don't really care which one I choose, so it feels a little random. But other things, we have very definite choices about. The fact that I'm not eating some cereal that I absolutely hate, that doesn't feel random at all. That feels like a choice to me. So you can easily imagine yourself making decisions and not knowing why you made them, and then catching up to yourself having just made that decision and observing it and being like, why did I do that? Like, why did I turn left? Why did I, do this? And just being surprised in the same way that you're surprised when you see a random number generator. So I would argue that if the if the will is randomly determined, we would be able to recognize that it was being randomly determined. And so using Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is that, free will, with free will is that we actually do have free will rather than that randomness somehow disguised itself to be free will. And I think there was one more, okay, so one other argument that I make for this, which I didn't make a slide for, essentially, if you think about what's evolutionarily advantageous, the illusion of free will doesn't really have an evolutionary advantage. Like doing what will help us procreate the most and take care of our offspring until it procreates the most has a much bigger evolutionary advantage than, giving the illusion of free will. So why would the illusion of free will be a likely potential random attribute for the human mind, let alone potentially animals, which I think have free will too? Why would that evolve? So doesn't feel very strongly defensible to me. I don't really argue that one with people because I feel like that's the easier part of the argument, but some people disagree with me on that. That's fine. We can agree to disagree. I'll still talk to you about it in the conversation portion if you want to go there. I'll try to understand what makes you believe it, to be honest, and listen to understand. But next, I'm going to ask the question, does everybody have free will? And the answer is no, not everybody has free will. Only the people who believe they have free will, because the people who don't believe they have free will and don't try to exercise it just do what's the most likely thing for them to do in a particular situation. And that is why belief in free will is important, because if we don't exert our free will, we allow our fates to be determined by randomness or other people's wills. And I will tell you, almost all of the really bad wrongs done in the world were done by people who had strong wills and forced other people to follow them blindly off of cliffs. And so if all of us use our will and we all improve our critical thinking skills so we can better discern fact from fiction and wisdom from folly, which, by the way, is the third intention of the FTI, we will create a much more fair and much more just world, especially because those first three intentions, being our best self-seeking truth and being fair, helps guide us in the right direction. Transparently sharing our beliefs and listening with an open mind to other people's beliefs helps us right our wrongs, especially when we have good critical thinking skills. And after all those three, help us see the truth more clearly and be more fair. The truth of being more fair is about increasing happiness and decreasing harm. And we can do that for the world at large and the people we can influence. And that helps increase our happiness and that of the people that we can influence. And so I would argue the will can be distinguished from randomness if it exerts itself based on the arguments I've given so far, but it's impossible to show that it always does. And the reason is because it doesn't always, because some people cede their will to randomness or other people's wills, in which case they're giving in to nature and nurture. So, not everybody exerts their will. I think everyone has the potential for free will, but not everybody uses it. Next is how strong is the will. I'm going to talk about this at another event, but I will give one example of a person with a pretty strong will. And I don't think, I forgot to put the link in, but I'll be able to pull it up. This guy has no arms and legs, and he swims. I don't know about you guys, but if I had no arms and no legs, I would think I was fated to never swim a day in my life. I wouldn't have even imagined or considered the possibility of swimming. This is a real video. This isn't made up. There's like news articles written about this guy. He was born without arms and legs, and he swims underwater with no arms and legs. That is, to me, the sign of a very powerful will. Like, you don't just do that. Like, that's like, a lot of it's a lot of bravery and determination to do that. But there are lots of other examples of feats of willpower that you can look at, people who have exhibited very strong feats of willpower. So next, have we shown free will exists? Remember our definition that multiple potential outcomes are possible. I used Gödel's incompleteness theorem to show that the future cannot be determined by the laws of physics themselves, that randomness and or free will have an impact. And then I think I also showed by Occam's razor that free will is the simplest explanation for why people have a sense that we have free will, our intuitive sense. Once we believe determinism is wrong, and that we've shown that determinism is wrong in step one, that Occam's razor says that the simplest explanation for our illusion of free will, which we all agree we have at least an illusion, the most simple explanation for the illusion of free will is that the free will is real. It's not an illusion after all. So falsifiability, I like to always find a way that I can be proven wrong. So here's an experiment that could prove me wrong. If someday scientists can complete the following experiment, then I will say that I could be wrong. Where a participant gets hooked up to a neuroscientist equipment, before the participant is even told what the study is about, the neuroscientists will predict what number that person will choose between 1 and 1,000. And the neuroscientists will record their prediction. Then they will ask the person in the study, choose a number between 1 and 1,000. If the neuroscientist can, with 100% accuracy, decide which number that participant is going to choose, then I think that's a pretty good experiment that would prove me wrong. That would show, predictability of a seemingly random choice, non-deterministic choice, a number between 1 and 1,000. That said, until you can get a very high pass rate with that, I'm going to stand by my argument unless someone finds a logical reason to find flaw with it, in which case I'll change my mind. So a few related topics. I'm going to go through these quickly, and then we're going to go to Q&A. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. These are some things that suddenly make sense if you believe in free will. Heisenberg uncertainty principle says you can't know the position and velocity at the same time of a particle, a subatomic particle. And the reason is because free will may impact the velocity of that particle before the next observation. And if you accept that free will could actually influence that particle before it's observed again, then you know that you can't actually determine both the position and velocity of the subatomic particle. So actually free will is a very good explanation for that. It also removes the mysteries of quantum mechanics, as I talked about, because the seeming randomness, yes, there might be some randomness, but the randomness in the microtubules of the brain, which Penrose and Hammerstein have traced consciousness back to, is actually not randomness at all. It's the impact of the spirit on those nanotubules in the brain. And I did a presentation on how I think free will and consciousness interact with each other, which kind of described that, which we can go into more another night. Next is incomputability in the double slit experiment. So it's been pointed out by some of my essays readers that the self-defining statements could be incomputable in the physical, like in Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Those self-defining statements are incomputable because they're neither right or wrong. The system just can't answer it. It's like a does not compute, like a divide by zero. So in that case, the reason is because the mass energy can still be influenced by a non-deterministic force. And so in the double slit experiments, you'll notice that when the photons are observed, they have a definitive location where they're observed. As long as there's an observation done, they have a definitive location. And so they act like a particle when they're observed because free will can't impact them anymore. They've been observed. But before they're observed by free will, they act like a wave because there's a non-determinism. There's a possibility that they could be in one place or another, and we don't know where they're going to end up until we observe them, because theoretically another will may impact them before they get there. And so it actually makes a lot of sense. The double slit experiments confuses everybody these days. But I think there's actually a very logical explanation if you simply accept that free will exists and that the observer effect is not, and I don't want to use the term observer effect because that means something other than what I want it to mean. But basically, it's not that the observer is modifying the thing that you're looking at. It's that you are, setting in stone that observation when it's observed. It's a little bit of a different type of observer effect than what's talked about in physics. The observer effect in physics is where the observer is changing the way that the thing goes. It's not that you're changing it, it's that you're making it make a choice as far as like where it actually was when it was observed. Next, I talked about consciousness. Adequate determinism, by the way, is the only type of determinism I believe in. It leaves space for free will in the way that I defined it. So I do subscribe to this type of determinism. It's the only type I subscribe to, but it's the redheaded stepchild of determinisms. And basically, quantum randomness events, I think, do even out for the most part at macro events. I think always they even out at macro events, but I think the spirit is an exception to that rule. And I think that animals have spirits as well as humans, but not all life does, like bacteria, I don't think does. And that's where, for me, life becomes meaningful when it has a spirit, when it makes non-deterministic decisions. We talked about that in our conversation on abortion, which was a very controversial one. We do talk about controversial stuff here. Free will can be very controversial for people, as we've seen. So that said, that's the end of the presentation. I would love to know in the chat whether or not people learned anything today, whether you learned anything new or not, whether or not it was useful. So I'm going to start with questions from Robin. Robin, you're on mute. All right, I don't hear Robin. I'm gonna try to ask him to unmute and him or her, and then if not, then David S. David S.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah,
Robin's
go ahead.
not, yeah, if Robin's not gonna talk. That was an interesting approach of things. I can't say I see the unification of the diverse ways you looked at it. I would point out that one way to see these things, which you didn't mention, I'm sort of disappointed not to have it mentioned, is that there is a distinction between our discussion of the external, physical, empirical world and the discussion of our ideas about it. And that we want to be clear when we're using concepts, which of these concepts are entirely about things that are not outside in the physical world, and which things are about our thinking and the processes of relating to the external world, a sensation, and our forming concepts, and the physical world, as it appears to us itself. So looking at things as objects is what science does. And talking about the behavior of objects works under the presupposition of determinism. That's what it presumes. For every effect, something before it will be found that was sufficient to make that happen. Okay? Quantum mechanics didn't satisfy Einstein. But we still say, well, I can explain what happened, at least probabilistically. I'm giving you the full description of what happens, and everything we look for in science, it's going to be giving you a deterministic point of view. That's its way of thinking. Anything else is magic to it. Anything else is a failure to understand. The fact that we are stuck with the quantum mechanical framework resonates in Feynman's statement that anyone who thinks they understand quantum mechanics doesn't understand quantum mechanics. It's past understanding. It's merely a description of what science is looking at, which is a deterministic view. The view of the world as determined is science. But the view of the world of ideas, us as intellects, us as thinking, conceiving beings, is not that world. That's a world of intelligence and thinking and understanding. That's our presence as consciousness. These are two different realms. And Kant calls it the realm of nature, with the laws of nature. Those are deterministic. And the realm of freedom, because we can't see ourselves as predetermined. We can't actually see ourselves that way. We can construct a theory that maybe I can prove it, but you cannot look, even the most, as you said, deterministic individual in science doesn't actually look at themselves that way. Now, once you put that schism in and you're honest to that, then the concepts you're using, you realize whether they're scientific concepts or they're other concepts. So the questions of morals, the questions of the person who's the evil murderer, and we say it's predetermined, you're now treating them as an object in science.
Try to finish your
Okay,
thought.
and I'll finish with this, because there are certain things that agree with what you said and other things that you really ought to consider. That in the world of science, there's no value. There's no worth. So humans are nothing special. They are part of the world. Anything else is laid on top of science, okay? So it doesn't, of course, when you ask the question, if it's a determined thing, he killed everyone, should we put him to death? It doesn't matter scientifically, okay? There's nothing to help you over there. You have to invent utilitarianism to weigh things that have no weight. Oh, how important is his happiness? Okay, the value in the world has to do with free will and the view of consciousness of itself. And that's where human life has meaning and value. Meaning.
Right. And I think we're agreeing in a lot of places. The few nits that I might pick is that one is if determinism is right, all there is the physical world. And so you're basically saying science only analyzes the physical world, and everything can be reduced down to physical things, and therefore our thoughts can also be reduced down to, connections between synapses in the brain. So theoretically, if the determinist is right, science is the end all be all and has the answers to all questions. I think I did a good job proving that that's not true.
It answers no question of what is valuable. So it doesn't even have that question in it. So it does not answer everything. It answers only about objects, not value or thinking.
Well, I would say psychology experiments, which are scientific, do answer questions about value, and they do create experiments on non-deterministic decisions that human beings make. And so psychology is the field that actually focuses on, the study of human beings and our decisions. And therefore they are the epitome of, and why has psychology made so little progress in so long? It's because they're trying to operate in a non-deterministic world with deterministic premises. And so of course they're confused. Of course they're lost. If they simply exist, that free will exists, they'll do so much better. We'll learn so much more about the human psyche if we can simply accept that part of it is free will and how much we exercise our free will.
Well, some psychology does assume that, but when you think you're measuring something that you have called value, and you're using the words without having found out what they actually refer to, then you claim you're doing science and you're just doing statistics gathering. That's all you're doing. Anyway, so go. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Next, Fred.
Thanks for a really thoughtful and imaginative argument and a good presentation, Garrett.
Thank you, Fred.
I actually agree with the some aspects of the gist of your conclusion. However, I do have some quibbles with the methodology. First is the application of Gödel's incompleteness theorem to the universe, because Gödel's incompleteness theorem applies to formal languages, which can be mapped to as you say, to a Robinson arithmetic. A Robinson arithmetic in turn implies a successor operator and a zero element. And I don't entirely see how that corresponds to the physical universe. However, it might be that you can construct such a formal language using the universe mapped onto the universe and apply Gödel's incompleteness theorem. But I think you need to do that extra step. And secondly, the part of the truth that uses Occam's razor. Occam's razor is a heuristic and not a rule of inference in logical systems. So it can't be used definitively in a deduction. Occam's razor says that if we have two, the most common version, says that if we have two equally plausible descriptions or definitions, states of affairs, that we should apply the one that's simplest. It's simply heuristic. Using it the way you have done, I could, for example, use the same logic to prove that plants have free will. And the way I would do it is I would say that the way that an organism uses sunlight that impinges on its surface, there are at least three possibilities. One is it could use the energy for glycolysis, but that tends to be very inefficient with a 10% energy yield. Or it could develop mitochondria and store energy, or it could use photosynthesis. And if we went through 1 year of PChem, 1 year of organic chemistry, we could understand the complex mechanism of photosynthesis. If in addition we spent maybe an extra 2 years in evolutionary biology, we could posit a possible evolutionary mechanism for the evolution of photosynthesis in plants. That's all very complicated. But the alternative is simply to say, well, plants have free will. They photosynthesize because they chose to photosynthesize. Now, that is certainly the simpler hypothesis, but I'm not sure that anyone argue that that's a proof that plants have free will. So I think the best we can do using Occam's razor and using the mechanism you tell is to justify a rough approximation, an indication that we can entertain the possibility of free will, and maybe that's the best we can possibly do, period. I'm curious about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so just so you know, I only used Occam's razor to distinguish between whether or not our sense that we have free will, our intuitive sense that we have free will, is more or less likely than the fact that we actually have free will. Like, meaning, did our feeling that we have free will, come about randomly and disguise itself as thinking it is, a form of sentience, and really we're randomly controlled, by randomness? Or is it that we have free will? And I'm a Bayesian epistemologist, so while it's not a formal logical rule of inference, formal logic rule of inference, I agree with you. It is a strong, solid belief used in proofs on a regular basis that says one thing is more likely to be true than another. And so I use it as such. Again, like I don't want to digress too much on that, because, once you prove determinism is wrong, or once I've proved determinism is wrong, I find it really hard to imagine that, our feeling that we have free will is randomness disguised as free will. Again, if anyone wants to formulate a reason they think that's more likely to be true than that we actually have free will, I would love to hear it. And so, yeah, I appreciate your comments. I do, by the way, there are actually some pretty good arguments that plants do have free will, believe it or not. I know that sounds crazy, but there have been studies that show that if you put a sharp object next to a plant in the position where it could cut it, the plant perspires. There have been examples of plants that do resource sharing that seems counterintuitive and against the evolutionary nature of the plant, where like older plants will give off their resources to younger plants to help them propagate, although you might argue that that's a propagation of offspring. But there are some interesting things. I think if they have any free will, it's a very, very low amount. They did something really, really bad in a past life. You know, again, I'm not going to try to make the argument that plants have free will tonight. I'm just saying, you know, there are people who argue that they do, and I remain agnostic on that. So.
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Garrett, because I've read and heard about all that you've just stated as well. So
And apologies, everyone.
personally-
I forgot to say that as Jenny just did, like if someone wants to respond to the topic that we're talking about between me and someone else, I want other people to feel free to join in. Like I don't want to feel like it's only, you know, me and the other person able to talk. So other people are welcome to jump in and chime in. Jenny's a regular, so she knows that. But I was supposed to announce that in the beginning. I don't want to spend like a lot of time, but if you have like a 5 to 10 second or 15-second response to what someone said, or a clarifying question that you want to ask someone, don't use it to introduce new ideas. And each time that you raise your hand, only introduce one idea or one comment at a time. You can raise your hand as many times as you want, but that'll just help us keep going between the large number of hands that are up. So thank you, Jenny, for your comment.
Let me give you a 15-second response.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
First, thanks so much, because as a Bayesian probability background, that makes it a lot more sensible, and you might add that in some fashion to your paper. You can do
Yeah,
so.
I should. Thank you, Fred. That's great feedback.
And secondly, I'm going to have to be more careful about what I say around plants that have long vines that could strangle me.
Well, they're very limited in power, but if you have a poisonous plant that you think it might just slip itself into your drink, then I'd worry, you know, like you don't want those plants to poison you in the middle of the night. No, I'm just teasing. So yeah, I think it's a good idea to add the Bayesian epistemology, because I do think some people get you know, they don't like the Occam's razor because it's more likely, but it's not on as solid ground as the other part. So thank you for your comments. Les.
Thanks, Garrett. I think there's many points that I'd like to push back on, but there's just one thing I'm not
Pick
clear
one
on.
at a time.
I'm not going to pick any points now. Maybe this will come out later. But I've got a question. There's one thing I'm not clear on. So it seems you use quantum indeterminacy to push back against the determinists. I can understand that. But you seem what I'm thinking about, questioning, is your metaphysical basis for the capacity for free will, because you seem to bring in the spirit very, very late, and you don't say much about the nature of the spirit, its properties, where spirits come from, how they actually relate to, how they interact with the physical parts of our being. So I'm guessing, are you some kind of dualist, that there's two kinds of substance in the universe? There's a spirit substance and there's a material substance. You're shaking your head, so I'm curious now. Where did this spirit? Where did this spirit come from? What are its properties, and how is that interaction? What happens at the interaction point, the barrier between the mind substance or the spirit substance and the physical substance, our brains? If you could just say a little bit about that.
It took me over 10 years after writing the initial version of the essay, Les, to realize that my argument defending free will logically implied, and I always used to think dualists were crazy, to be honest, and then I became one because I realized that if the laws of physics themselves can't determine what creates the next moment in time in the physical universe, something else has to. And if it was physical, it would be part of that universal truth machine. So there has to be something non-physical, metaphysical, not made out of mass energy, which I call the spirit, that is the essence of ourselves, that is influencing the next moment in time. And that just solved a whole bunch of other problems that I went into at the end. You know, the acknowledging the existence of a spirit solves a bunch of intractable problems. You know, the Feynman quote about anyone who says they understand quantum mechanics doesn't understand it. I think if he believed in free will and if he had come tonight, unfortunately that wasn't possible. But you know, maybe it actually is an explanation for what's going on with quantum mechanics. And by the way, I did not use quantum indeterminacy. What I did is I explained why quantum indeterminacy happens. It's the other way around. I'm explaining quantum indeterminacy rather than using quantum indeterminacy to prove the existence of a spirit. I'm basically using Gödel's incompleteness theorem to show that the world is not deterministic, and therefore something else must be influencing the future, and that something else must be either randomness and or free will. And if randomness and or free will exists, that explains why quantum indeterminacy exists in the first place. So it's actually the other way around. I'm explaining it, not using it to explain. Does that make sense, Les?
Oh, yeah, sure. I understand that, but you were using, it seemed you were using quantum indeterminacy as an argument against the determinists, not in support of there being spirit,
yes.
but
Sorry,
against the determinists.
With Bell's
But
inequality, I was using quantum indeterminacy to say Bell's inequality basically shows that quantum particles can't be deterministically decided by mass energy closer than outer space. And that basically makes it almost unfathomable to think that, you know, the one law of physics defies proximity, you know, inverse square Field's law, or otherwise closer things have a bigger effect than further things, other than, you know, in quantum mechanics, right? Everything else in the laws of physics is one way, and then suddenly in quantum mechanics, when things are really, really small, suddenly it's totally different. That's very unfathomable to me. But like, if someone wanted to believe that, like, all right, I'm not going to argue with them. I'd rather they try to shoot holes in my argument defending free will.
But I was hoping you could say something about the nature of spirit, where it comes from, what are its properties, and the interaction between the spirit world and the physical world. What's happening at the barrier? What's the physics or metaphysics there?
Yeah. So I can, and I've spent a little bit of time thinking about this. I won't go into it in a lot of detail, but I'll say a metaphysical spirit, I can't imagine how such a thing would evolve in a deterministic world. How do you come up with something metaphysical from a physical world? It doesn't make sense. So there has to be some higher power, is the term that I use, and that's the God that I can defend, logically defend, is that some higher power seeded us with a spirit. And I would argue that evolution is right. I'm not an anti-evolution person, but I think that what happened is that life on Earth got complex enough that it could house a spirit, and then some higher power imbued that life with a spirit, and we've had it for probably billions of years on Earth, you know, starting from very simple life forms. And that's why I say maybe plants do have a spirit. Maybe, I don't want to go one way or another yet. I don't know enough to even have a strong opinion, but I have data points and that's it. But, you know, so that's the origin answer. And that then begs the question, where did that being come from? And that's why I say that I think the God that I believe in is eternal, because where could that come from? Like, it couldn't have come from anywhere. It must have always existed. And I don't think that God created the physical universe. I think the physical universe is eternal as well, and God has existed eternally alongside it. And so that's, you know, if you watch the video, I don't know if you were here for the Origins of the Universe talk, but I think you might like it if you like cosmology. You might find it intellectually interesting. But you know, I'm not a theist, so I don't think that God created the physical universe. I think it's always existed, and God has existed alongside it in parallel. If I missed any questions, raise your hand again, and then I'll get to it. But we have a lot of hands up, so I'm going to go to Remco. Good to see you, buddy.
Hi,
Thanks for your great talk on the two-part brain. That was fun.
I got another one. I'll talk to you another time.
Reach
Hey,
out to
look,
me. I want to hear it. People love your
yeah.
talks, Remco, and I do too. So, yeah.
Great.
Reach out to
The
me.
whole idea, look, I think it's great what you're doing. You're provoking conversation. We may not agree with you, but you're prepared to throw your hat over the fence. And I salute you for doing it. Seriously, because the whole concept of free will determinism is still a battlefield. And you got people like Brian Greene, you know, he's quite a respected physicist, and Sabina Hossenfelder, who are very vehemently against the notion of free will. And I think one of the important things in this, to be very clear what free will is. Free will is something very explicit. Otherwise, we get into semantics. I mean, free will is not about a person being able to swim without arms or discussion about trees. It's whether, you are totally the agent of the experience. And you may come up with other terms. But quantum mechanics is a good starting point. There is a problem, and there is a disconnect between the real world and the world, classical world, and the world of the quantum world. There is a discontinuity there. The way Schrodinger's wave function gives us accurate, very accurate, deterministic answers. Yet they are statistical. You already have this conflict, and it goes everywhere. But look, getting to the point, and I have a particular point to raise, and that is in respect to Gödel. You mentioned Gödel a few times. Now, remember, Gödel is about logic, and to take it beyond that I think is a bit problematic. I don't know that you can say that. Look, it's about formal systems, and it's basically saying there are aspects of, like cognition is a formal system. Hey, who's to say that Gödel's incompleteness theorem isn't about your cognition of the world? That is what we can't say, because there is something about cognition that you cannot prove or disprove, which is, really, that's what Gödel's theorem does. And so you come to the point then, Garrett, and this is where I start to, first of all, I sound a little bit incoherent because I am confused. I've read all the pros and cons, and I cannot take a side. However, Gödel's theorem, when you take the Gödel's theorem, I would say that it would be more logical to apply it to how you create your reality, and there is something about it that you cannot know or prove. And I rather like, and I'm going to conclude with this, Bruce Hood, who's a professor of psychology, and he went on to say, and then he's not alone, he says the evidence is that the self, now listen to this, is an illusionist spin doctor giving us ownership over outcomes already made. Perhaps I should have put it in the chat, I will. And it creates thoughts that it considers helpful for dealing with fears and to help with social connection. So in other words, we're not the commander-in-chief, but we've got the spin doctor mind that gives us ownership over events as if we're making them. Now, here's a professor of psychology at Bristol University. So that's why I link it back to Gödel's theorem, and I was like, well, careful with that, because it could be just the way we construct a reality. Anyway, I conclude with that. It's a little bit incoherent, I realize, but I can't make a clear case one way or the other otherwise.
Yeah, not incoherent at all. I actually didn't do a good job presenting the formal structure in the essay. Like, for anyone that read it, I did a more I think complete perspective. Like, I think I presented better the formal system that the Gödel's incompleteness theorem ties to formal logic. Basically, I created the statements like formally that that the universe is basically taking, the point in mass energy. I kind of alluded to it, but I didn't go into it in detail about how it tied to formal logic. But there is a construction of what I described in today's presentation in the essay that you may want to read, and I think you would appreciate more than most people, which is why I didn't go into it in too much detail. But the other thing is I didn't cover the straw man arguments against free will. Hopefully I didn't need to with this audience, because it's a bunch of really smart people. But there are people who go, well, if you don't have the free will to grow wings and fly, you don't have free will at all. And guys, that's not free will. That's called omnipotence. And none of us argue that human beings are omnipotent. So That's not what free will is, and that's why I defined free will in the beginning. So that said, appreciate your comments, Remco, as always. And Jason, go ahead. And by the way, I'm going to skip some people that have already spoken. I think Eric hasn't spoken yet, so I'm going to have him go after Jason, and then because there are a lot of hands up, and we're starting to get a little bit later in the evening. So Jason is next, and then Eric after that.
Yes, hello. I guess I had just a few questions because, like the last guy, kind of it is confusing, right? So can I pose some questions to you?
Please, I would welcome that.
All right, so I'm driving a self-driving car, right, a Tesla, and I come to a fork in the road, and then for whatever reason the car has to turn left or right. It's initiated by coming to a fork in the road. If I shake a random magic 8-ball and it tells me go left, is that something similar to what you're saying, or can the person in the car take the wheels and say, "Oh no, I'm gonna turn it right"? Is that your idea of free will? Because I might not have the scientific thing. I like analogies and stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
Is that
if you're driving a self-driving car at a forking road and the Tesla decides which way to go, it was the algorithm written by a Tesla engineer. So you are ceding your free will to the Tesla engineer.
No, I'm saying the car shakes a randomizer, right? Whether to go left or it's absolutely random. So a scientist observing it from in space would say it's random.
Right.
So is that it's not determined, right? Because it's random in that case.
Truly random, then it's randomness. And that's where I said I think randomness and free will both exist. I didn't go into the randomness part a lot because today's talk is about free will, but I do think both exist and things can be determined randomly. It's just, that for me wasn't the focus for tonight. But yeah, I do think you can decide randomly.
So you think the spirit in this? I'm sorry. The analogy: the person in the car is the spirit, right? And the car is the body determining, and it shakes a randomizer, wants to go left. I say, no, I want to go right. Is that your idea of free will, is doing what you're not, what your body or your.
So I think you're trying to make an analogy where you're assuming that the decision that a person makes is random instead of entertaining the possibility that it could be the result of a will. Am I right?
Well, this is the problem I have, because even in that case, right, the fork in the road makes you shake the magic 8-ball, or whatever that comes up with, you have to go wherever it tells you. So I don't see, even if it's not determined, even if it's random, I don't see that as free will either. Like you, I do think there has to be a spirit somewhere to,
I do think there needs to be a spirit, but what would, in the case of just to take your analogy literally, because I generally like to do that, to take the analogy very seriously. The Tesla engineer decided to put a random number generator into whether to go left or right. And as society, if that random decision got you into an accident and a smarter algorithm would have avoided an accident, I think we would hold that Tesla engineer responsible, not the engineer, but the company responsible, and your family could sue if you got into an accident. And even if it was randomness, that doesn't absolve the person who decided to use randomness of the responsibility of choosing randomness as the decision maker. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and this is the other thing you said initially when you started this whole thing about holding people accountable if there was no free will. And the answers that I got is, you still can hold them accountable even if there wasn't free will, right? Just like, even if like a robot, you just see them as not bad, but as malfunctioning, robots, and you could decide to terminate them. Or if they do good, you reward that, not because, they're good or bad.
If you put the serial murderer in jail, you can say, well, I had to put them in jail. That was the only thing I could do, right? And the problem with determinism is you can justify anything, because you could put the murderers in jail, but you could also give them extra guns in the morning to go shoot more people, and you could say, look, that's all I could do. Don't hold me accountable. Like, you know, and so you can basically rationalize anything if determinism is right.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Eric, do you want to go next? Because I don't think you've spoken yet, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the presentation. And I have a small problem with the question itself. Like, I don't understand the question of what we are asking here. So like there are two topics. One of them is free will, and the other one is determinism. So I put free will aside because defining free in the free will and having will, defining them, I don't see a solid definition for them. So like, I put that aside. But about determinism, when we are asking if determinism exists or not, we are asking if we can determine the future, right? So if you think about the word as a function, if we are giving it two input, one of them is the current state and the other one is the input of the time, it's going to output one outcome, like one output, which is the future. So the word itself is already determining. So there is a determinism, but I think the question we are asking is predeterminism. If we can predict what's going to happen, for example, you use the example of the box, like the black box, that we ask it anything, it's going to give us the correct answer. So if you're talking about the word, we're not just talking about the material and the energy, we're talking about the information. The information is part of the word. So does the answer that the machine gives us, is it also part of the word that we are trying to predetermine it or no? Because if I can ask the boss, let's say I have like a basket in front of me and there is a blue and a red ball, and I ask the black box, which color do you think I'm gonna pick? And whatever answer it gives me, I choose the other color. So even though it has the knowledge of everything in the world, it has a knowledge of all the physical law, and it has all the knowledge about me, it doesn't know the answer. It's going to give it to me at the end. And that knowledge itself is part of the word. So how could the idea of determinism be possible when everything is still within the word? It's more like the set problem that when we have the universal set, does the universal set itself include itself or no? Because if it does, then the universal set is greater than the universal set itself. It's a contradict. So I think the question here is kind of wrong, or at least I don't understand it properly, because how could we determine the world we are in it? Because we are a part of it. So we are trying to determine ourselves. So like, I don't understand how could the question of determining the world is possible when we are part of the same world.
How could the question of determining?
Yeah, so like if the question is determinism true or not? Like, is determinism exist or not, right?
Right.
That means, can we determine the world or no?
No, it's not about can we, it's about whether or not the future is determined by only the laws of physics themselves, not about whether or not we can predict it. So everything I talked about tonight is what's theoretically possible, not what's currently possible with the technology we have today. Does that distinction make sense?
So like when you say using the law of the physics, what's going to use the law of the physics? Because the law of the physics is trying to understand the law of the universe. So the universe itself is going to determine its future, because it does.
Well, you're assuming that it's the only thing that does. Sure, the laws of physics are part of what determines the future, but if my first argument is right, actually, if my second argument is right, there's more to it than that. There's also randomness and or free will of sentient beings that also determine the future. And so that's where, you know, I know you said you didn't understand my definition of free will, but I pasted it in for you so you could take a look at it, and maybe raise your hand again if we have time. We only have about 10 minutes left, but you know, I did define it quite precisely, more precisely than the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, if I could make such a bold claim. I don't mean to offend any philosophers here, but they keep it very short and simple, and I try to be really precise with it because I've dealt with this for a long time, and had a lot of conversations about what is meant by free will. And I try to make a very clean definition for free will. So maybe take a look at that.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that. But like the last thing you said about determinism, which the question. So the question is, if the law of the physics is determining the future. Am I saying it correctly or no?
So the way that it's described in philosophy is it's called the natural laws. But I think most people would equate the natural laws with the laws of physics. But if you wanted to make a definition of the natural laws that included a spirit, then you could make a good argument for compatibilism, because you would say that the natural laws include a spirit, and your idea of determinism is adequate determinism, which leaves the opening for the type of free will that I advocate for. And so, sure, I'm not going to disagree with a person who advocates for that, because essentially we agree in form. We may disagree in semantics, but I don't care about semantics. I care about the spirit of the conversation. And in spirit, I would agree with that person, even though they would call themselves a determinist, an adequate determinist. I'll agree with an adequate determinist.
You mentioned short and simple.
What's that, Robert?
You mentioned short and simple. Can I say something short? I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead.
Consider the planetary system. Astronauts can route a. It's very deterministic. Otherwise, you couldn't send people to the moon. Now, I imagine, just in my imagination, I get a call from Godel, and he's outside the system, and he has an asteroid, and he throws the asteroid at the solar system, and now you have wrecked the determinism. You've come in from the outside, and you've wrecked the determinism. Now that's one example. Let's go to another example. And let's say I'm traveling a road, and I come to a fork in the road, and I decide to take it. I take one of the forks, and I claim that is totally. I claim that is totally free will, and maybe there's somebody outside the system who is a neuroscientist, and he says that well, I know why you took that fork in the road. That's determinism. And then I say to him, no, I have free will because I don't know anything about neuroscience. I don't know what you're doing. I'm inside my own system, and I damn well I had a reason for taking the fork in the road, and it's my reason. And I say to the neuroscience, it's none of your business why I took that fork. I have free will.
I'm not sure what your point is.
My point is that free will and determinism depend on what system you're talking about. If you're inside the system, it goes one way. If you're outside, it goes the other way. It can go the other way.
So just a quick note. I'm not sure if Robert was referring back to my question or no. So when it comes to determinism, my understanding is that we are talking about the whole world. We're not talking about an isolated system, because you cannot make an isolated system within the world. So the whole world is an isolated system and include everything. So there cannot be anything by definition that exists and it's not part of the world. So determinism is
one thing when you talk about free will that I'm not sure is clear is it's one thing to say that free will is a concept, but such a concept must lie somewhere. That is, there is something that has free will. Is it a person? Is it a universe? Is it the solar system? What is it that has free will? You must. I claim, you can disagree, that you must name that something. It's not.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue all sentient beings, and the very definition of what has free will is a sentient being that makes non-deterministic decisions. If it doesn't make non-deterministic decisions, it doesn't have free will yet. But that said, I want to let Lori go. And Robert, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand again because you started a new topic there, if you don't mind. And Lori, go ahead. I don't think you've spoken yet, so I want to let you go next.
Thanks. Determinism versus free will has been debated for many, 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 many years, and probably will be for many to come. Quickly, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this. Would you say both arguments have been argued both ways to manipulate populations?
I don't. Why, I guess, why would you think that it was? I don't think that it was, but help me understand why you think it was, and then I will be able to form a better opinion.
I haven't studied in this area, but I've spoken to some philosophers, and I was interested in your thoughts in the way of governments manipulating populations to make them feel that the population is making a decision that maybe the government is setting the framework for and facilitating, or in making a population feel that they have no decision to make, it's predetermined. Whether in the case of whether they want the population to sit back or move forward.
Yeah, okay. So now I know where you're going. I do think that how do I say this? It's easier to control a bunch of poor people by saying they have no choice but to be poor, and that's how they were born to be, and they shouldn't try to do anything about it, just keep, tilling the land and giving me my portion as the landowner. Like that's what your job is. Don't ask for a fair wage. Like, yeah, that's a way of controlling people, and I do think that there could be truth to that. I think though, like, I haven't thought extensively about it, so that's like my gut reaction, not a well-researched point. I looked at more the theory behind it, and it's not just been debated for many years, it's literally millennia. So thousands of years that this has been debated, and I'm trying to make my part. I don't think that the argument that I've given tonight has been given before, at least not that I'm aware of, and I've done a lot of research to try to find it. The closest thing I found was that someone, about 5 years after I started circulating the essay, tried to use Gödel's incompleteness theorem to defend free will, but I think they did it very poorly. So, I don't think, like, I think that it's a novel argument, but that's my job. I'm an inventor, right? I'm supposed to come up with novel ideas. So, that's what I do. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you for your question. And it's that would be a good follow-on event. So, like, to talk about like implications of free will, like how strong is free will, and what are the political implications of having or not having free will, whether you believe in it or not. Playing a little game theory. If there is no free will and if there is free will, what are the implications in both directions? That might be interesting.
And legal as well.
Yeah.
We have charter rights now in Canada in constitutional cases. And there's this idea as we move away from a theological society that we should have the right to make our own decisions. It's interesting that the charter is about negative rights, not positive rights, but it is making a shift in society. Yeah.
Interesting. So next is I think it's Jacob, but Jacob, is your name Richard now? I thought it was Jacob.
Richard is my legal name.
Got it. Okay.
Jacob was the name given to me at my circumcision.
Got it.
And most people.
What do you prefer to be called?
Well, Richard, for the sake of avoiding confusion.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm gonna, as I listened very carefully to from the beginning to what you were saying and to what others were saying. So I'm going to read what I wrote while I was listening. So first of all, what is will? Will is the movement of the past conditioning of the brain body. Will is the movement of a brain body that is highly conditioned by active memory. By active memory, I mean religious beliefs, philosophical ideas, political ideologies, your bundle of experiences, values, culture, race, ethnicity, nationality, etc. That, in other words, all the memory that makes up this thing called me, your identity, the I, the me, the self, the mind, the perceiver, the listener, the experiencer, the chooser. Therefore, as long as there's will, as long as the brain body is tethered to the past conditioning, there is no freedom. And without freedom, there is no true presence. No attention is happening. No lucidity is happening. No perceiving is happening. No listening is happening. No connection is happening. Communication, communion, sense of oneness with everyone and everything. None whatsoever. There's only what passes for presence, what passes for listening, which is what the me, the I, the self, the mind imagines it to be, based on its limitation, based on its limited knowledge. Knowledge is always limited. Based on limited experiences, experience is always limited. And anything limited, finite, is fragmented, broken up. So now, there was a discussion of spirit. So let me go into that. What is spirit? This is very interesting. Soul, spirit, heart, even. Oops, sorry. So this is what I wrote about soul. And again, these are words, the words soul, spirit, heart, I'm using them interchangeably, okay? Soul is not a separate entity from the brain body, as the religions, the traditions have taught us. They are just, soul, spirit, heart are just three words for the same state of being, referring to a brain body that is totally free of the I, the me, the self, the mind, the will, the perceiver, the listener, the experiencer, the chooser, which again is this bundle of active memory, right, which is the past, which is not what's happening now. And when there's that freedom, then we say soul is happening, spirit is happening, heart is happening, oneness is happening, true love is happening, true peace is happening, true creativity is happening in each and every moment of daily life, 24/7.
Thanks, Jacob. All right, thanks, Richard. So I think we're using different definitions of free will, from the way you described yours, and maybe different definitions of soul. And I use soul and spirit sort of synonymously. You add heart to it, and I can see why. I won't disagree with that.
They're just different words for the same thing. I'm just really referring, don't get caught up in the words, right?
Yeah, I
See
don't.
what the words are pointing to.
I care about the concepts. Yeah.
That is totally free of conditioning.
Right.
That's
and
all
that's
they
where
refer
I would, say like no brain is totally free of conditioning. We all have influences on our current state of being. We all had
Well, first of all, you don't know that. When you say no brain, you can only speak for yourself. You can say, my brain is not free of conditioning. You can't say all brains are not free. You can't say that. You haven't examined all brains, right? You could say your brain is conditioned and that you have not found a way to be free of the conditioning. You could say that as well.
So I think we would have to get into a long definition of what we mean by conditioning. And I think
I already said what it is. It is your beliefs, your values, your culture, your race, your ethnicity. Right. It's all the memory that goes into constructing this thing called me, myself, the mind, These are just different words for the same bundle of active memory. It's acting right now as the listener. It's saying, Richard, I agree with this. I don't agree with that. This makes sense. This doesn't. It's accepting. It's rejecting. It's believing. It's disbelieving. That activity is the activity of this active memory. It's the thing that's doing the thinking. The memory, the bundle of memory, your beliefs, all of that, is doing the thinking, is doing the processing.
Thank you.
That means you're not paying attention. You're not free. There's no freedom happening. There's only the conditioning happening. You get it?
Well, you haven't examined my brain yet either, Richard. So,
oh no, I'm not saying anything about your brain.
Okay. So I appreciate everybody coming tonight. We had a great showing. We still have 50 people here. It's the longest we've had at the end of the night. We had over 70, I think, at some point. And hope people will come back next week. We're going to talk about 5 simple rules to live a better life. It'll be about the 5 intentions of the Freethinker Institute, which are our common values. And I think that they're good general advice that are agreeable by all reasonable people. But if anyone can find a reasonable reason to disagree with them, I'll change them. I just want to make them useful to people and to help guide people to live a happier, healthier life for themselves and the people they can influence. So that said, I really appreciate everyone's great comments, questions, the discussion, the attention, for listening. And hope everybody has a great night and hope to see you guys next week. Also, feel free to join the online community. I'll put one more link. Follow this quickly because I got to shut down. It's been up since really early, as usual. But that has the link to the Discord community. If you go to freethinkerinstitute.org, it'll also have the link to the Discord community, which is our online community. And we can continue the conversation there throughout the week. Thanks a lot, everybody. Hope that you all have a great night. Nick, I didn't realize you were here. I'm sorry that you didn't raise your hand. I would have liked to have heard from you. You're not a failure, Nick. We appreciate you, and I appreciate your thoughts. And I would like to help you be happier if you want to reach out to me in the online community. It sounds like you're going through a tough time. So I hope everybody has a great rest of your evening and hope to see you again at future events. Thanks a lot, everybody. Take care and have a great rest of your evening, and I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.